right.
So, Mary Dale, is there anything else you need to do before I get started?
Yes. So, okay. All right. So, all of you, I believe, are very familiar with Maggie. And Maggie, we want to thank you for being willing to step up and talk about wellness in terms of both suffering and loss. And that can be, the loss of somebody you don't even know, but just the fact that you are aware that people have lost somebody. So, and as a chaplain, I'm sure you're going to share with us, how much of this that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, and also how this impacts you. So thank you again. And the screen is all yours.
It's all mine. All right. As you were talking, Mary Dale, I was thinking about my day yesterday, which involved a patient that we've had for 3 or 4 weeks, actually, in the hospital, who is a man just a little bit older than I am, who was visiting family from Mexico, who came down with COVID. And we had, been working with the family, trying to make them understand that this had nowhere to go but death. But their religious beliefs and what have you had them, holding up for un milagro, right, for a miracle. And I got to work yesterday, and the nurse, called down and she goes, "He is dying today." I'm like, okay. So I went up there. He had been de-isolated because he'd been so many days since his diagnosis. So I sat next to him and I, prayed in Spanish with him. And he was intubated, not conscious, and his stats were falling. Well, I went back down to my office for a while, and all of a sudden there's a code blue. And I'm like, well, that seems strange. I know he's a DNR. I ran up there, and we had a 48-year-old gentleman who did not have COVID, but had other issues going. And he had a cardiac arrest and died. And then about an hour later, my other gentleman died. So that's what I do every day. Is just, that loss after loss. So I watch not only for what families need in terms of support, and the patients themselves, if they are suffering and they're facing their own mortality, but also the staff and eventually myself. But I do all that through poetry. So, so today we're going to have a few different balls up in the air. This morning, I guess it's afternoon, wanted to explore suffering in the context of COVID. And we will try to look at some definitions of suffering, particular ways we suffer during a time of COVID, and how we can mitigate suffering / build resiliency. And what do we do if nothing's working? And the first thing I want to say is that I have no answers for you. 0. Or just kind of identify some of the issues and maybe hear from one another about how you deal with these things. But there are no answers because we're all different. We all have different levels of resiliency and ways that we think about suffering and look at suffering. And maybe, today we might see a different way to look at suffering. So we should define what we're talking about when we say suffering. So Merriam-Webster, God love them. Suffering is to submit to or be forced to endure something like martyrdom, or to feel something very keenly, labor under something. I suffer thirst, to undergo, to experience. And I think that's the hook that most of us come into suffering, that we are experiencing something. To allow, especially by reason of indifference, the eel suffers little birds to sing. I don't know how well William Shakespeare is going to help us, but to endure pain, death, distress, to sustain loss or damage, to be subject to disability or handicap. So those last 3, the intransitive verb suffer, I think that's really what we're talking about. So, and before we get very far, I would want to hear from you guys. When you think of suffering, what do you think about? What is your definition of suffering?
Emotional, physical distress.
Okay.
Sadness.
Okay.
Can be a feeling of hopelessness or helplessness, one or the other.
Anguish.
Loss.
Loss.
I think Dave said anguish.
Yes, I got that. Anybody else?
No way out.
No way out.
What struck me about the definition, the first one was to submit to have to submit to it.
Mhm.
And though there's a feeling of pressure and inevitability and inexorableness.
Mhm.
I think of pain mentally, physically, and spiritually.
Pain. Yes.
It can be a transition time.
Hurts.
Okay. Transition.
Has to be.
Anybody else?
Testing.
Okay.
What did you say, Bob?
Testing.
Testing.
Surprise.
Something
I
you
think
weren't
it-
expecting.
Yeah, I think it might feel really private or alone. You might feel very alone.
Okay.
I think you're suffering when you can't anticipate anything else, but more of the pain.
Out of control.
So what I've got here, what you all have said, emotional or physical distress, sadness, feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, anguish, loss, surprise, a sort of desperation of a no way out, having to submit to something. It can be private. We feel very alone, isolating. That it's pain, whether emotional, spiritual, physical. It can be a time of transition. It can be a time of testing. It is trying to face something that you could not anticipate, and that you cannot anticipate a way out, and a feeling of being out of control. Did I catch everybody?
Yeah,
That's
I
one.
think, I think so.
Okay. So I thought we'd look a little bit about how others define suffering. So one article that I read was a prolonged experience of psychological or emotional pain that may follow an unexpected negative event. So this kind of feels like something has happened, an event, something definite and in time, and that this is the consequence of that event. Eric Casal, who is one of the earlier ones who did a lot of research into suffering, he wrote, suffering extends beyond the physical. Most generally, suffering can be defined as the state of severe distress that is associated with events that threaten the intactness of the person. Okay, suffering occurs when an impending destruction of the person is perceived, whether that is your physical well-being, your mental well-being, or spiritual well-being. And it continues until the threat of disintegration has passed, or until the integrity of the person can be restored in some way. And this is, I wanted to share what someone else said about, defining suffering, that a gentleman in his 70s who is days away from dying in a palliative care unit says, with tears running down their face, I don't want to die. That is his suffering. A parent with teenage children tells their doctor that her source of suffering is the fact that she will lose having a physical connection to her children after she dies. That is her particular suffering. A young man in his 20s newly admitted to hospice says, I feel like I haven't left enough behind, and that's their suffering. So suffering is going to look different. Who we are, what time we are in life, who is around us to help bear that suffering with us. Patient, the word patient comes from the Greek word, I'm not going to say that, which means one who suffers, which I think is, so my context to how I enter into thinking about suffering is that I come from the perspective that all my patients are suffering. By virtue of being a patient in the hospital, there's suffering going on, even if it's a planned procedure. There's something that has set that person into disequilibrium, that things are a bit askew, that something is threatening them, their well-being in one way or the other. The other thing that on the previous slides where it talks about an event that precipitates the suffering, it does not address things like chronic illness, which is ongoing suffering that has no end in sight. Sequential grief, when one grief follows another, whether it's someone dying or you've lost your job and you've lost your marriage and you've lost this, one thing after another. And we've all had times in our life when we've been through that, and we've all known people who it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this has happened to them after all these other things. And it doesn't address things like a pandemic. It's not just an event in time. It's this, oh my gosh, will this ever end sort of thing sitting in front of us. Viktor Frankl wrote the amazing book years ago called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he says, human beings' main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in their suffering, in their life. This is why they're even ready to suffer on the condition to be sure that their suffering has meaning. So this is something we're going to be coming back to. Can we make meaning out of our suffering? And does that make it any better? And through adversity comes resiliency. And we're going to test that, though, whether we think we believe that or not. And does it always mean that? I thought it was interesting to kind of throw in, we've all have some of our own Christian ideas about suffering, the suffering Christ, the suffering servant. But Buddhism, I think, offers some insight into suffering for us. One Buddhist teacher states, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. That's it. That's all. That's Buddhism in a nutshell. All sentient beings experience suffering, whether it is a human being, whether it's an ant, whether it's, some other creature. All sentient beings experience suffering. And the Four Noble Truths are suffering exists, suffering arises as a result. I can't see all my words there. Suffering can be eliminated, and we eliminate suffering through right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right effort, right livelihood, right mindfulness, right concentration. So suffering's out there, and it comes, and there may or may not have a specific cause, and it can be eliminated. And so that's the goal of someone who embraces Buddhism, is to try to mitigate suffering as much as they can in their world, in the world around them. Again, something that we might test to see whether we really believe that all suffering can be mitigated. Okay, I said see article, which means I have to find the article I am looking for. Okay, yes. I had read this wonderful article that talked about homeless in life, and was specifically targeting older adults, that the gravity of loneliness in their life, that they feel homeless even in their own life, because it can be defined as loneliness expressed and stemming from existential suffering. Suffering as a loss of communion with one's partner or other loved ones, whether that person has died, whether they have left, whether we are separated because of COVID, although this was written before COVID. A loss of meaningful social activities due to isolation. And we know a lot of older adults, and now all of us have experienced a loss of meaningful social activities because we have had to be isolated. And a loss of health due to frailty and vulnerability. That if we think of homelessness, or when we think about homelessness, somebody who doesn't have a home, somebody who doesn't have a place. If we think of that we are homeless in our own lives, that we don't have a place to live our lives fully. And that is suffering. One of the participants in the study, which was done in the Scandinavian Journal of Caring Sciences, which I want to find out more about their Journal of Caring Sciences, says, it pains me that all my loved ones live so far away from me and that I'm not able to visit them there anymore. It is difficult for me. It often feels empty and lonely. And I imagine a lot of us are feeling that way, whether our family is across the country or across town, that we can't be with them. Therefore, we are suffering. So that's kind of a definition of suffering. Is there anything people want to add, want to comment?
Oh, I want to add, my mother in her Alzheimer's didn't understand that her brothers and sisters were not alive anymore. And her suffering from that was acute. She used to say, I used to have a family. I used to be part of a family. And that caused her, I think, more grief than anything else, that I could not produce the family that she didn't even have anymore. So that's an experience that lets you suffer way beyond reality, what reality allows most of us.
Well, yeah, and that I think is an example of there's no way to mitigate that suffering.
No.
There's no way to make that better for the person, to help them build reserves and resiliency to combat that suffering. It's just suffering.
Well, and it's cruel to try to combat it, I think, because it can't be done.
Well, and that's how often, I mean, people that I've known who they have a parent or a loved one who has Alzheimer's, and then that person's partner or another loved one, or maybe a child has died. And it's like, don't tell them, because they're not, every time they see you, if you're going to have to tell them all over again. And so that acuteness of that suffering is going to be just like a wall of bricks on them. So there are times, I'm all about telling people, being honest with them and stuff. And I'm like, not when they're going to have to relive this every morning when they wake up again and they don't remember. So anybody else? Okay. So one of the ways that we can face suffering is to turn to scripture. We also glorify in our sufferings because we know suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and then character, I can't read all my words, and hope does not put us to shame, because the love that's been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So that, we just embrace this suffering. We love this suffering because it's going to build perseverance and character and hope. And this is a good thing. The suffering is a good thing. That's how I read this often. Maybe that's not how it was intended. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their cruel taskmasters. Indeed, I know of their sufferings. And so God is going to deliver them because God knows they are suffering. And I think that's, and we also, we have the entire book of Job. And I love Job. I love Job on many, many different levels. But that first chapter, when Job suffers these unimaginable loss after loss, to me, it's visceral. I mean, my heart clutches, I catch my breath because I just can feel how much suffering he was experiencing, knowing loss after loss. And yet the thing that we all know Job for is that he was all set, nope, I'm going to keep praising God. It's going to be fine. God's going to take care of me, until it got really personal and he got boils. And then it was like, nah, all bets are off. this is too much. God's not playing by the rules here, because now I am personally physically suffering. But I guess that's a question to put out. Are there places in the Bible that when you are suffering, whether it's physically, emotionally, spiritually, that you go to that help bolster you, that help you at least know that you're not alone? You didn't realize it's going to be a Bible test, did you?
Maggie, I tend to rely a lot on the lilies of the field, though I don't know that that's really suffering per se. But when I get into places of angst and worry, it helps me refocus. That works for me. As you know, I want that one read at my funeral.
Yes. Okay. Everyone take note. Who was about ready to share something?
Oh, I was just asking, but I think I realized the answer to my question. I was going to ask Tim what he meant by lilies of the field, but I realized that you were referring to the biblical passage with the lilies of the field.
Sorry, I was being abstract.
Jesus said, I am with you always, even to the end of the world.
Hearkening to kind of the AA philosophy, when suffering for me, whether it's painful, emotional, happens to family, what's going on in the world and everything, and I can't take it anymore, it's just give it to God.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I think when I was younger, and so I think therefore for our young people, when suffering is fresh, when we don't have the experience of knowing that suffering is just a state of reality,
Mm-hmm.
it is comforting to know that through these stories that suffering has been universal and that people get through it one way, I mean, not always as an individual, but as a people, we can get through it.
Yeah. Well, and I tend to go to the Psalms, because I find like Psalm 121, Psalm 46, Psalm 91. Those are some of my go-to ones that,
23rd.
Yeah. My rock and my redeemer, my Goel.
But when I don't know what else to do, I go to the Lord's Prayer is my mantra. And because that's the only thing I can say from memory.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think for me, that is the beauty when I've had the privilege of praying rosary with a patient. And lately it's been with a patient who has been intubated and not awake, and in Spanish. But that repetition and those words, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And you go through that over and over and over again. It's that mantra that can lift you out of your present reality and just kind of wash over you like a warm blanket around you, kind of. Anybody else?
I'm not sure. Oh, excuse me, Judy. Go ahead.
Okay, I was trying to figure out if I was. Go. Okay, but it's gonna echo. I was gonna say that. Thank you. I thought it was up. I was gonna say the last part of Romans 8 has a lot of good promises in it. That all things work together for good kind of idea, and that nothing can separate us from the love of God through Christ Jesus. Some of those are comforting to me.
Right.
I don't tend to use scripture for this kind of thing. I use music.
Uh-huh.
I like Fantasy on a Theme by Thomas Tallis by oh good old what's his name? Vaughan Williams. Brahms' First Symphony. If you listen all the way through Brahms' First Symphony, it heals almost everything. Sometimes I think that words are an irritation and I just can't deal with any more of them. And so scripture sometimes feels just like words to me.
I understand that.
I don't know
Maybe.
where it is in the Bible, but a friend sent me a card once and it says, "Fear not tomorrow, God is already there." And I can take a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah.
I think for me, the experience that I had with my mom's death, what started off that looked like it was strep throat, ended up being a very aggressive cancer in her lung and abdominal region. And between the day she was diagnosed and the day of her death was only 6 days. So everything was very rapid and unsettling. And but right before she died, all of a sudden something up in the corner of the ceiling caught her attention, and she was in awe. I mean, you could see the awe in her face. Literally all her wrinkles disappeared, and she was just, you could tell she was totally engrossed in what she saw. And that just gave me comfort beyond belief, because she was going someplace she was looking forward to. So.
St. Francis de Sales said, this is found in the Essential Wisdom of the Saints. Do not look forward to what may happen tomorrow. The same everlasting God who takes care of you today will take care of you tomorrow. He will either shield you from suffering or give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put all anxious thoughts and imaginations aside. Put aside all anxious thoughts and imaginations. There is comfort for me in this, and there's also some indignation. Thank you. So, because it's like, really? That's all you think about my suffering? Is I'm just being anxious and I'm imagining things? No. This is real. And I don't think, for me, it's not an either or sort of thing. I'm very, very postmodern. So everything has an asterisk, and besides that, it says it depends. That I do believe with all my heart that God walks with us in all things, and that when we are down in the pit, God climbs down into the pit to be with us. And when we're ready to be lifted up by God, or when God thinks it's time to lift us up, then we are lifted out of that pit. But that should not minimize my feelings of being anxious, and that my suffering is not imagined, it's real. So there's both comfort and some pushback that I have for good old St. Francis de Sales. The big thing that I have found throughout the literature that I've been reading is that we are better able to deal with suffering when we can attach meaning to it somehow. God is the source of strength, not the cause of suffering. Getting through the suffering with God's help allows the suffering person to construct order out of the disorder of suffering. The person is supported with this foundation. No matter what happens, God remains with us, and so the foundation of our lives remains intact. Some different studies have been found, because of course, nothing happens without a lot of research behind it, and because if it doesn't have research, it's not real, right? Research has shown that people who can find meaning in their suffering build resilience and have a more positive outlook on their life and death, period. And that seems very common sense. And what also seems common sense, but did need to have a lot of, to talk with a lot of people and record their, what they had to say, is that it's a lot easier to find meaning in your past suffering than it is to find meaning in your present suffering. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? When you're in the middle of it, it's really hard, especially if it's also accompanied by physical pain, to put some meaning onto this. You can look back at, I can look back at the summer from hell that we had when both of our moms died and my daughter's friend committed suicide. And there's all kinds of meaning now that I can attach to it. I can look back and see the things that grew from that. The resilience in my child, the resilience in myself, the ways that I better understand people who are suffering grief because I had been through that experience. In the middle of it, it was just awful. And I just didn't know if I could take another breath at times. So that seems commonsensical, but it's worth saying. And spirituality and religion help people find purpose, significance, and coherence. That the idea that the world, and this is the way the world works, and this is my experience of the world, that we can make sense out of that somehow. That our beliefs can help us keep that together in the face of suffering and can lead to greater feelings of well-being, that I'm okay in my life. So there's that. So minor sufferings of the soul, such as, not getting our way, not getting recognition, enduring inconveniences, these little everyday sufferings that we have, they help build our suffering survival muscles for the big stuff. So that when we encounter a major suffering that has the potential to just bring us to our knees, these past sufferings and how we have dealt with them, how we've survived them, helps us to reflect backwards or remember what sustained us in the past. Or if we haven't done very well at flexing those growing suffering muscles, it can completely crush us as suffering after suffering builds over us. So what I've said about meaning, finding meaning in suffering and building on the past, does that make sense to people? Does that ring true with you?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think those experiences are like tools in our toolkit. And when we come across those situations again, if we can pull ourselves out enough, we can say, oh yeah, I remember I need to look at the reality of what's going on and try not to stay in my head. So yeah, I can really see where they are helpful.
And sometimes even if you can't make meaning of it now, the fact that you have been able to make meaning later out of so many things gives you, well, okay, at some point this is going to make sense to me and I can hang on till then, a little bit to go on.
Mm-hmm.
But I really think that building your suffering muscles, that's very important. And I think sometimes we try to jolly children around too much, keep them from suffering. And then they end up handicapped because they don't have any experience with it.
Well, I think I've shared this with people before. My mother, God love her, she was a little bit of an odd duck. She started dragging me to people's funerals when I was like a preschooler, people I didn't know. She would just, people die. I was always going to funerals. And so I was used to seeing people not awake in boxes and people crying around them and the flowers and the whole bit. And she told me at one point, this is so that when somebody dies, you're not scared. Mm-hmm. And as it happened, when I was in 6th grade, one of my classmates died from drinking poison. Oh. And so all the other kids that showed up at this funeral, who'd never seen a funeral before, were completely freaking out. So I was running around, patting people on the back, going, it's okay, explaining what was happening, even though his grandmother, who was from Italy, was kneeling in front of the casket, wailing. That was a new one on me. But I was able to okay, she's just crying really loudly. And I'm used to people crying at funerals. I know that. So that then by the time my dad died, when I was just out of high school, I had enough muscle built up that I could deal with it. So, and sometimes I think as, as we grow older, those who are younger, behind us, that we have a role to play in helping them build those suffering muscles as well.
I do think it's why the challenges of young adulthood are so acute, and transition is so fragile for so many, and especially maybe now. They just really don't. They haven't had, by sheer lack, because most people's parents don't bring them to funerals on a weekly basis. They don't know what to do with this. But I do think that there is suffering for which it is pretty hard to find meaning for, other than to face the fact that there's just vast amount of ugliness in the world. I mean, it's real hard to find meaning in the Holocaust, or, I mean, there's no meaning to that. It happened. It was horrible.
Yeah, and
I think individuals can find meaning in their experience, perhaps, but as a world event, I struggle with that. It could be sometimes too easy for there to be meaning, and therefore it to slide into God's will really quickly, and I just don't go there.
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't know whether suffering can be defined as a global event. I think suffering is best understood on a personal level and in a community sort of level, but not when it gets to the global arena, like you said, it's like it's too big. It's too big to manage, too big to get your head wrapped around, and too big to find meaning. And I think the other thing that you said that I thought was very telling is that, younger people, it's hard for them to deal with suffering, to deal with transition and stuff. And when you've got some elders around you that can help guide you, that makes it easier. I think the problem that we're all experiencing right now is that no one, not our elders, not our youngers, nobody has experience with this.
Right.
Living in a pandemic, looking, the last big pandemic we had, big one, we've had pandemics since then, but the big one was over 100 years ago. So ain't nobody around that lived through that can, speak a word of hope into this abyss. And so we're having to find tangential suffering muscles, resilience muscles to flex in order to deal with this thing, this pile of doo-doo that we have in front of us right now. And
that's why we need to read.
Pardon?
That's why we need to read. Plenty of people who lived through all those things have written about them. And it's possible to learn what their suffering muscles did for them. And when people come out of a big, horrible thing like the Holocaust, usually the meaning is that I now must tell that this is
and that's
possible.
Viktor Frankl.
That's Viktor Frankl. That's just about everybody. That's Elie Wiesel. You don't make meaning of the event. You make meaning of your life in response to it.
Right. And what is this going to look like? Okay. I deal a lot in palliative care. That's my area of specialty as a chaplain. So palliative care is an approach that improves the quality of the life of patients and their families facing the problems associated with life-threatening, although we usually say life-altering illness, through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. Thank you, World Health Organization. As if it just takes a prescription of something to fix suffering. And that's the thing. Yes, we try to identify moral distress and suffering in our palliative care patients, but that does not necessarily mean that we are going to mitigate that suffering. We're going to help them look at their suffering and help, support them how we can so that they have the best chance of making meaning out of their suffering. Usually what I ask patients is I ask, have you had hard times before in your life? Oh, yes, 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 yes. I'm like, well, tell me about them. Tell me about an event in your life. And they'll tell it to me. And I'll say, well, what got you through all that? And I am usually kind of shocked at the number of times I have people just give me this blank stare and say, I have no idea. They've never reflected on the events in their life to say, this is what really got me through. Then there are those people who will, it was my family, it was my faith, it was my church, combination, all of the above sort of things. But a lot of people, unfortunately, go through life without really examining that life and examining, their own pain, their own suffering, and what helps them get through the day. Unfortunately, we know all those people who do self-medicate, that they're suffering, they compound their own suffering by taking unhealthy actions. So some of the challenges that we have with suffering, and I think we've already started talking about this, can meaning always be found? Can the energy to find meaning always be found?
Nope.
Nope.
Nope. Well, I mean, if you can't, the best thing I know is to say, okay, this doesn't make any sense to me either, but I will sit with you. I don't know anything else to do.
What a good elder thing to say. And that's, I think for a lot of us, that's, again, it's a challenge in the time of COVID, is that we're used to, when somebody's suffering, is to go be with them.
Be with them, yeah.
To hold their hand, to be in their presence. We don't have to say anything. We don't have to do anything. We just have to be. And we can't do that the same way. It takes a lot more, it's not as organic as it might have been. It takes a lot more effort, that you've got to, FaceTime with somebody or call them on the phone, and you can't touch them. I had a nurse, one of my most favorite nurses, who is a nurse manager. And she was coming up the hall, and I had my box of chocolate, like I carry around sometimes. I was like, so how many of these things do you really need today, Susan? And she's like, a couple. And I gave her 3. And I just looked at her and I said, hug. And she said, could I really have one? And I just like, okay, I'm just going to, we both had our shots. And she just fell into my arms. And it was meaningful to me that I could actually touch somebody, and I could do something, but that human need to physically be with others, to touch other people. And that's what's compounding our suffering right now. And there's no easy answer to that. Mm-hmm. And so we get exhausted, and it's like, oh, I don't care if there's I can't deal with it. I am too tired and too strung out to even think about meaning right now. Go ahead.
Is the second thing there, according to palliative care definition, suffering can always be prevented or relieved? Is that realistic? I guess personally, I question whether it can always be prevented or relieved. I really question that. I also have whether people want it relieved.
Or should it be relieved?
Yes, I recall my aunt, who was certainly a person of faith, and thank God daily for her suffering, because that brought her closer to God. So, or that for whatever reason, I just remember her saying, "Thank God for this suffering," and so I guess that's my question.
Well, yeah. And so that's part of my role on the palliative care team, is to push back when I think, wait, let's look at the bigger picture. Is this what this patient really wants? Is this in this patient's best interest to try to fix this thing that may not actually be broken, may be very uncomfortable for you to witness, but may not be broken?
She's already made sense of it. She's already found meaning in it.
Exactly.
And the other thing that I think of is there's the suffering, and then there's your response to suffering. If you're horrified by suffering, that's not suffering, that's horror at suffering. And if you could find a way to dissipate your own, assuming the other person is doing the suffering, but not necessarily. I have a friend whose had a terrible year. Her husband died. All sorts of things happened. And she said, my only real advantage is that I'm not afraid of sadness. I am not afraid to feel bad. She says, everyone else here is afraid about my feeling bad, and it makes it harder for me. And I thought that there's, and the outrage at the feeling that you have of how terrible dementia is in its later stages, that's not part of the person's experience. That's you know? And so at some point, if you can kind of find a way not to live in your own reaction to the pain or the grief, but actually to be present with it. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a difference.
Yeah. This is my suffering. Get your mitts off of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but boy, I'm remembering, I mean, I have been a therapist, and people suffering, the depths and torture they endure is, I don't know.
Well, I think there is a
I'm
difference.
struggling with finding this out, sort of passing over this easy, like, because the young man who committed suicide because he could not stop the pain really did have no way out. He had gone through every medication, every treatment, every option, and he could not endure any longer.
Well, and I think that is the struggle that we have, is to know, when do I need to sit with the suffering to just be in it? When does it become clinical? There's suffering, and then there's clinical suffering, which does need to be addressed by a professional, which does threaten the well-being and the life of the person experiencing it. Yeah, Timmy?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of listening to what Chris was saying and what Kathy's saying, and I think for me, it's recognizing, and maybe I'm just restating, I don't know, but it's that sense that it is not my suffering to fix necessarily, and it's not Siri's trying to come on, and it's not. I don't necessarily want you to fix my suffering. I want you to sit with me. And I often find, maybe some of you have had the same experience from the other end, I often find when people come and try to fix my problem as opposed to just hearing me, then it actually adds to my suffering. And I try to remember this as I interact with people, that I guess I probably am just restating you, Kathy, Chris. But I think we so often, the way in which we relate to suffering as people, generally speaking, is out of fear of it and out of an unwillingness to look at it before we act. I'm probably just restating.
I think the people who need our help are those people who have no tools in their toolbox to deal with the suffering. They don't, whether they've not had the experience, whether they don't believe in their own experience, whether they just have poor coping skills on a good day. Those are the people that are going to need that extra boost.
But and sometimes we've gone through every tool possible
in the toolbox. Yeah.
I mean,
because
I'm wanting to make real sure that we're not somehow blaming the victim. We're not having enough to. I know we're not, but we're running close on that language of insufficient tools, inadequate, inexperience. Sometimes suffering is of such magnitude that it is literally overwhelming.
And I feel like in that situation, the final tool is committing suicide. It is the ultimate way of ending that suffering. And if that's the last resort, maybe that's okay. that person's suffering is ended. It's the people that are left behind that continue the suffering.
I did my dissertation on the Thurston High School shooting, and there was a young teen who wanted to be left alone. It was in a group setting and just didn't want anybody to try to talk to her or anything. And so she was sitting there, and then this trained dog came up to her and put his head in her lap and gave her the comfort that no person could have. And she ended up writing a poem that was just touched my heart even to this day. But sometimes the relief can come from somebody other than another person. Such as your cat, Chris.
Well, and I'm also aware, and I think you've spoke to this, Maggie, because I know that this is, you have to find this. We've all been saying, is the strength to sit with somebody else's pain. You know, that's, I mean, I had so many clients tell me, you are the first person who could sit through this whole story, and that I didn't end up having to feel like I had to take care of you.
That is very annoying.
Yeah. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, I didn't realize that was a surprising attribute in a therapist, but apparently it is.
The ability to care without making your caring an additional burden.
Yes.
Yes.
That, you hit that. So one of the other challenges, I just included this other quote, is a failure to draw a distinction between pain, which can usually be controlled, physical pain, and suffering, which eludes control, represents a profound misunderstanding of human suffering. And yet control of suffering has been presented as one of the more important goals of palliative care. But it's also, I think that's the whole thing. One of my palliative care doctors loves to tell patients, like, yeah, well, I got more drugs than you got pain. So don't you worry about, being, because often we have, what's your hope for the future? That I have a pain-free death. Okay, we can work on that. That's an attainable goal. Now, the rest of you, we can't necessarily fix. But that's the thing. Suffering, when it's separated from physical suffering, eludes control. I like that that idea that we can't control how we feel, how we experience something that somebody else seems to bounce back from right away, but just feels like this horrible weight around us. And I think that's the end of my slides. Yes, they are. Aren't you glad about that? So like I said at the beginning, I have no answers per se, but just thought we could kind of explore a little bit about suffering together and give each other that support that we need and we look for. Maybe draw some wisdom from one another. I don't know if this has been what you expected or what you were hoping for.
Been very good,
That's
Maggie.
great.
I want to let you know that I have a plaque in my office that I often refer to. I know not what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And I agree with that. We don't always have the meaning in our sufferings, but we can trust God and know who holds the future.
I remember, well, maybe am I off?
You're here.
We can hear you,
We can hear you. We can't see you.
but
I
that's
just-
okay.
I
Oh.
just remember
Oh, I'm
before-
sorry.
before Lloyd died, I just finally said to him, everything that you needed to do is done. You can go now. It was just awful. It was, I felt disrespectful, and then I felt that I had to do that for him if he could hear me. But I guess anyway, it was not good, but it's what I had to do.
I remember saying something similar to my mother. I said, you've done You've done as much as you can. You've done a good job, and you can go now. And you've prepared the rest of us to take over in your place. And I don't know that people need permission to die, but it seemed to me to be the thing to say at the time. You know, what do? You say what comes to your mind.
Well, it's that reassurance. I kind of usually add, it's like, you've done such a good job raising your kids. Everything they are is because you raise them to be the people. So you know that they're going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're going to miss you terribly, but they'll be okay, and we'll help take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it kind of borders on trying to fix the dying person. I don't know what you're going through, but I feel really uncomfortable and I want to fix this. But it's also a message to the family. Pardon?
Just in case this is bothering you.
Yeah. Well, and it often tends to be more a message to the family that's gathered around that this is going to suck. It's going to feel horrible. You are going to suffer, but you're going to be okay because your mom, your dad, your husband, whoever has been in your life, and you can draw strength from that relationship even when they're not physically in front of you anymore. Being a human being is really tough, and it's hard, and it is a group sport, not a singular sport.
Yeah, it's the best job we have, though.
Yeah, pretty much. Anything anybody else wants to add?
I think this.
Just thank you. Thank you so
Sure.
much for what you've given us.
Oh, sure.
Kathy, you had something.
Well, it was just the singularity of this time. Is so challenging. And I just wondered if anybody wanted to spend any, I don't know where we are in time or if we're done with time, but.
Well, we had given ourselves an hour, so.
So if people want to keep talking, people want to drop off, that's fine.
Yeah.
Shall we perhaps plan more like every couple of weeks or so, a planned time to have this gathering? Just new things come up, things happen. I've enjoyed it as much as you can enjoy, subjects that aren't necessarily pleasurable to talk about, but it's a good chance for a little catharsis with a group of people who care. Plan another one?
Well, this actually seems to be also the aging in time of COVID sort of thing, that these are topics that are relevant in that as well, the suffering and the isolation and stuff. So I can make more of an effort of weaving some of this into that. What do you think, Bert? Would that work?
Good idea.
All right.
Yeah, because we're kind of already doing that. And people should join us. It's a good group.
Yeah,
we will be having one more of these wellness presentations by the public health director on the physical issues related to COVID. So that will be March 5th.
Or is it the 4th?
Okay.
Or is it the 4th?
Or is it the 4th? Who knows?
It's the Thursday, right?
It's the Thursday. Yes, you're right. It's the 4th.
Okay. Thank you.
4th. Eric is giving the high
Yeah,
sign.
I saw. Yeah, Eric was giving us the 4.
4 sign.
Thanks, Eric.
The what time?